Idealism, the idea that reality is somehow fundamentally mental, that consciousness is primary rather than matter, is an idea that shows up here and there across intellectual history and in many different cultures around the world, more popular in some contexts than others. Famous philosophers like Plato, Plotinus and the Neoplatonists, Adi Shankara, the Yogacara Buddhist, Hegel, Abhinavagupta, Bradley, and others are often counted as idealists, although there can be different approaches to and versions of idealism, of course. Today, after more than a century dominated by a positivist physicalism, it seems that idealism might be becoming more popular again, at least in the Western world. With the popularity of figures and thinkers like Bernardo Kastrup, with his analytic idealism and his fascinating solutions to some of the big questions about reality, maybe consciousness is making a comeback. But of course, it is worthwhile looking outside of the European and North American context to find representatives of idealism in other cultures, perhaps even cultures where idealism has been more prominent over these centuries and millennia, to the degree that it has developed into a lot more sophisticated forms sometimes. I already mentioned before the great Indian sage Abhinavagupta, who represents a tradition known sometimes as Kashmir Shaivism or as non-dual Shaiva Tantra, which is a beautiful and intricate form of monistic or non-dualistic idealism that flourished especially in northern India around the turn of the last millennium. This is a vision of reality where consciousness, represented by Shiva, is the fundamental reality of all things. But even in the Islamic world, there is a figure whose school and quote-unquote philosophy could be argued to be a kind of idealism, or at least something close to it, and which, in my opinion, also offers one of the most impressive, coherent, and comprehensive visions of reality, God, and the world. His name was Ibn Arabi, and while he is well known as one of the great mystics in the Islamic world, he's not as famous or taken into account in contemporary discussions such as these, even though I certainly believe that he should be. So what is the philosophy of Ibn Arabi? Can it be considered a kind of idealism or not? And what can it offer contemporary discussions about reality and consciousness? Ibn Arabi, his fuller name being Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, was a Muslim mystic, some would say a Sufi, who lived from the mid-12th century to the mid-13th, from 1165 to 1240. He was born and lived the first half of his life in Andalusia, what is today southern Spain, as well as in western North Africa, the so-called Maghreb. Early in his life, he started having mystical experiences and entered on the mystical path that is widely referred to as Sufism. But he was also highly educated in a number of different fields, not only the religious sciences like Quran and Hadith, Islamic law and literature, but also mastered fields like poetry, philosophy, and certain aspects of what we would call science today. The second half of his life, neatly from around the year 1200, he made his way to the Islamic East, to places like Mecca, Baghdad, Konya, and Damascus, where he settled and passed away in 1240. What he had done, in a sense, was to take all the accumulated knowledge from the flourishing intellectual and mystical culture of Andalusia and the Maghreb and bring that to the eastern lands, where he would have a massive influence and impact. In fact, in the Islamic tradition, especially in Sufism, he's often known as a Sheikh al-Akbar, the greatest master. And the school of thought that came after him and was influenced by him is generally referred to as the Akbari school, based on this title of his, Sheikh al-Akbar. One of the many things that made Ibn Arabi unique, among other mystics at that time, was that he was an insanely prolific writer. Right? Many other mystics would often avoid writing because, writing can never capture the realities of things and there's a kind of level of ego involved in writing. Ibn Arabi wrote a lot of works. There are over 200 individual works attributed to him, many of which survive today and have been translated into various languages like English. We don't have time to go through all of these works or really get into it at all, but very briefly we can say that at least some of the most famous ones include a work called the Fusus al-Hikam, the Bezels of Wisdom, the massive magnum opus called al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations or the Meccan Openings, and a collection of mystical love poetry called Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the translator of desires. So what is the quote-unquote philosophy of Ibn Arabi then? Well, the doctrine or idea that he and his school had become associated with is something often called Wahdat al-Wujud, which means the oneness of being or the oneness of existence. Some have called it a kind of monism or even a non-dualism, and these terms I am generally very skeptical. I think we should be careful using these kinds of terms because they don't really represent his thought in a fair and accurate way, but they can be starting places, right? It does point to at least some aspects of his wider vision. That can be a good starting place for us to kind of get an idea of his flavor and fragrance of his philosophy. To Ibn Arabi, God, the one divine reality, is all that exists. In fact, God is the real, reality itself, as well as truth itself, both terms of which are encompassed in one of the names of God, al-Haqq, which means the real or the truth, also the right. In a natural extension of the Islamic proclamation of faith, there is no God but God, it here becomes something like there is no reality but the real. It can be read like this. The world as we experience it, creation, to use theistic language, which he defines as everything other than God, ma siwa Allah, thus becomes a kind of illusion, a non-existence. But not in the way of a world-denying philosophy like Advaita Vedanta, although that is also an oversimplification, but still. The illusion of the world here is simply the idea that it is independent of the divine, that it is self-standing or self-existent, when in reality the world is constantly dependent on, and indeed is, in one sense, the one reality of God that projects or manifests itself to itself like a reflection in a mirror. So that's the first part of the term oneness of being, the oneness that is the fundamental reality of all things. But that second term, wujūd, is very important for our discussion here. Wujūd is a word that is usually translated as existence or being, and Ibn Arabi identifies God with wujūd or being itself. So God is not a being among other beings, but is being in and of itself, wujūd. With this in mind, the phrase Wahdat al-Wujud really doesn't mean anything else than the basic fact of monotheism. There is one God, which is pure wujud being, and that God/being is fundamentally one. There is one existence, and that existence is one. He writes in the Fusus al-Hikam, quote, "By virtue of existence, he is identical with existent things. Those things we call that which comes to be are exalted in their essence and are none other than he." But the Arabic word wujud itself hides more secrets that are important for understanding the scope of his idea. In Arabic, all words are based on roots made up of usually 3 or 4 letters, and each word formed from that same root is thus related in meaning to its siblings. This is why the word for Islam, literally meaning submission, is often also said to mean peace, because both Islam, Muslim, and the word salam, which literally means peace, are built from the same root, sin lam mim, or salama, which in its basic form means something like to be safe. So when we say that Islam means submission, which it does, that is always related to the other meanings of that root, like safety and peace, so that it is a peaceful submission, you could say. It's a submitting to peace, or receiving peace and security by submitting, right? So all these meanings are inherent in the fact that it is that same root. And similarly, the word wujud comes from the root waw jim dal, or wajada, which means to find. In other words, that which exists, mawjud, is that which is found. And existence or being, therefore, is the reality of finding and of being found, thus establishing that existence and consciousness and awareness, the act of finding, are directly connected, indeed maybe being the same thing. So arguably, when someone like Ibn Arabi talks about wujud, he means something like being and existence, but implied is always the fact that being in and of itself is also consciousness in and of itself, self-knowledge of that being. And another form of that root, wijdan, is indeed often translated directly as either consciousness or conscience and related words. This is why someone like Said Hossein Nasr could point out that within this linguistic tradition, we can find a near parallel to the Hindu/Vedantin term used for Brahman, or the ultimate divine reality, which is Satchitananda, being, consciousness, bliss. This can then be compared with the Arabic wujūd, wijdan, wajd, all coming from the same roots and same meaning, respectively being or existence, consciousness, and ecstasy or bliss. And thus, because they are all related in the root and thus in meaning, that being or existence of wujud is somehow the same as the consciousness that is aware of itself, which is also somehow the same or intimately connected with that experience of ecstasy. That experience of ecstasy is an experience of pure being, which has the nature of ecstasy and bliss as parts of itself, right? So it's very similar if we draw these parallels to the Vedanta tradition. So this is at least partly why I argue that Ibn Arabi's philosophy can maybe be seen as a kind of idealism. Not only because God/the real is seen as the only reality of which all things are simply manifestations, but also profoundly because he seems to identify the one being of God as something like consciousness itself. Right? So am I saying that Ibn Arabi is an idealist? Not necessarily. I want to put that out there, like for those Ibn Arabi specialists out there who might be coming for me right now. I want to clarify that this is an interpretation, right? I am basing myself on what I believe to be accurate statements and an accurate presentation of what Ibn Arabi says, but I am also presenting Ibn Arabi here as a contender in the discussion of modern idealism. Not necessarily because I think he neatly fits into the category of idealism, especially if we define it specifically as kind of, that reality is mental as such, right? There are arguments to be made for that too, as I have shown here and will continue to show, but it's also a bit more complicated than that, as I hope you understand. So this might be a bit contentious to some experts on Ibn Arabi, and I am certainly, as I said, giving an interpretation here to a certain degree, but it's an interpretation that I believe to be sound. Now, without going into the nitty-gritty of the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi too much, because then we would be here all day, what we can say is that the universe that we experience is, in a sense, God appearing to God's self in vast, limited forms in order for God to love and experience God's self from the perspective of another, although that other is really only metaphorical. Ibn Arabi uses a famous so-called Hadith Qudsi, where God says, quote, "I was a hidden treasure, and I loved to be known, so I created the world that I might be known." So the one being/wujud/consciousness has within itself an infinite amount of attributes. And as that awareness is aware of itself, it knows all those attributes as well as all the ways that those attributes can become manifested in fixed, determined forms that allow their relationships to be actualized. These infinite possibilities of things that can and will come to be are known as the ayana thābita, or the immutable entities that exist in God's knowledge of God's self. And they are all the things that exist in our reality, from its very beginning to its end. They are non-existent entities in God's knowledge that are quote-unquote given existence when they come to be in manifest reality. They never possess being themselves or existence. This is very important. They're only kind of granted, they're lent existence from God. So existence never belongs to them, but still, this is the image, right? They exist in God's knowledge, and then he breathes existence into them, and they manifest in reality as we know it, still within that knowledge of God. But they never exist in themselves. They are only the loci in which the being of God can manifest in a particular form. Even now, as we are existing and you are listening to me talking, we are only those non-existent entities in God's knowledge that are expressing and manifesting the light of being. There's a metaphor here, which I often bring up in these discussions, which come from the scholar and translator of Sufi texts, Robert Abdel-Hadi Dar, in an introduction to a translation of a work called the Gulshan-i-Raz. And he uses the analogy of a projector, right? So you have a projector and you're showing us a film or a video on a screen. right? And what we see on the screen, the film, is reality as we experience it. Okay, and so in this analogy, the light from the projector itself is wujūd. This is being, existence, also, as we said, kind of consciousness, if we accept that those are the same thing, right? This is God. This is the essence of God, which is identified with this being or wujūd, is this light that is infinite and beyond time and space and just expresses itself and shines. And then that light, in order for that light to appear as the film on the screen, it has to shine through these strips of film. We're talking old projectors and old, old equipment here, right? It has to shine through this film for those things to appear on the screen. That film can be seen as the ayana thābita, these immutable entities in God's knowledge. And again, what we see on the screen, or on the wall, or on the screen, is the world as we experience it. So what we see in reality is nothing but the light of being. That is what all of it is. And so we're experiencing the being of God. But also, that which makes the things in the film that we see as distinct things and they move around is what they are, precisely because they're different than the light. They are the things that block the light, and by doing so create these shapes. Right? So it is all being, but being limits itself through these forms and shows itself in these particular forms by delimiting itself, but it never in itself becomes compromised. The light itself never changes. It only appears like that on the screen. So this is a kind of analogy to help us understand the vision that he is trying to present here. The images on the screen are nothing but the light, nothing but being, but the images themselves are precisely what they are by blocking the light or shaping it. In this way, the things of the world are nothing but being, but also its very opposite, since we never have being ourselves. The only difference here where this analogy doesn't really work is that for it to fit perfectly with this vision, these strips of film would have to somehow exist inside of the light itself, because these ayana thābita are just things that exist within God's eternal self-knowledge of himself in his awareness of himself, which is the same as his being because it's all one, right? But still, I think it's a helpful analogy. Another one that Ibn Arabi uses is to say that he quotes an earlier Sufi who says the water takes on the color of the cup. Right, so water could be seen as being, and it's poured into this vessel, which maybe is colored. And so the water will then take on that color when we look at it through this glass, because the vessel has shaped it in some way without the water being changed itself, right? But it's been changed into we see it through the shape of this vessel, and it may be even the color of the glass of this vessel. And so the water takes on the color of the cup. This is what happens to being, right? It takes shape, but it never changes or compromises its oneness by doing so. So what does this mean? It means that the world of appearance is nothing other than the manifestation or reflection in being /wujūd /awareness of the infinite attributes and qualities inherent in being itself. It is the self-disclosure of God to God as another. It is the unfolding of possibilities inherent in infinite actuality. So when we experience a beautiful sunset, we are experiencing the beauty of God, which is true beauty itself, being displayed in one of the infinite ways that beauty can manifest. And in a profound sense, the experiencer of that beauty and the experience itself is one and the same awareness and being experiencing itself, but through the lens of multiplicity. Ibn Arabi himself also uses a lot of other analogies to explain his vision. One of his favorites is to play with the imagery of mirrors and reflection. In one place he says, quote, "The world of nature consists of forms in a single mirror, nay, of one form in diverse mirrors." This tackles the paradoxical perspective of oneness versus duality and their union. From the point of view of oneness, all things, that is, diverse forms, are simply multiple forms reflected in a single mirror, which is wujūd or the real. Whereas from the perspective of duality, One form, the real, God, is reflected in a multitude of mirrors, which is the world of multiplicity. But there is more to say about the mirror too. The essence of God, which is wujūd or being, consciousness, remains hidden and inaccessible while being the very reality of all things. It's like looking into a mirror, the mirror of being, of wujūd, and seeing all these images in the mirror. The images themselves are God insofar as they are manifestations of his attributes in limited form. They mirror his names. But it is also the images in the mirror, which is the world, that veil us from seeing the surface of the mirror itself. Remember, the surface of the mirror is wujūd, it's God's essence. So the images we see in the mirror veil us from seeing the surface of we never see the surface of a mirror. We only see what it reflects. So it's the same with the world. So this multiplicity that we experience in awareness, it's all a manifestation and reflection of being, but it is also those things that veil us from seeing being in and of itself, just like we can never see the surface of the mirror. It's a quite brilliant analogy. Quote, "When you see a form in a mirror, struggle within yourself to see the body of the mirror. You will, without any doubt, never see it." So God veils himself with himself. There are a lot of Platonistic and particularly Neo-Platonist features here, as I'm sure you can tell, but it is also significantly different in a number of ways. The immutable entities are sometimes compared by people to the Platonic forms, but that would be inaccurate. They aren't perfect forms of which limited existence are imitations or copies. They are the limited things themselves in all their multiplicity. If anything, the divine names and attributes of which the entities are manifestations would more closely represent the forms in Platonism. Lastly, I want to bring up another very significant point for my argument that Ibn Arabi is a kind of idealist, and that is his conception of khayāl, or imagination. This is a complex term with different meanings depending on the context, but is a core aspect of his thought. Khayāl is a human faculty of imagination, not just in the sense of making things up in the modern sense of that word, but that imagination is a faculty capable of comprehending spiritual realities beyond the limits of reason. This is because the other meaning of khayāl, the alam al-khayāl or the alam al-mithal, the world of imagination, is a dimension or realm that stands in between the physical world and the spiritual world, and which we have access to through this personal faculty of imagination. Among other things through dreams, where meanings from the spiritual realm can be communicated to us. In any case, it's not one of these that I'm focusing on today, but rather a third, albeit of course strongly connected, concept of al-khayāl al-mutlaq, or non-delimited, maybe absolute imagination. One of the absolute core aspects of Akbari thought is the reality of the human being as a microcosm for the macrocosm of the cosmos at large. Everything that is without exists within. And since we have our own limited imagination, we can also notice that this imagination shares a lot with existence itself. Indeed, to Ibn Arabi, existence itself as a whole, that is, created existence, the multiplicity, is imagination, or khayāl. It is the non-delimited imagination mentioned above. All of reality takes place within God's imagination, which of course harkens back to what we said before, that all existent and non-existent entities are in the knowledge of God. He says in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, quote, "The reality of imagination is continual change in every state and manifestation in every form. There is no true existence that does not accept change except God, and there is nothing in verified being, al-Wujud al-Muhaqqaq, except God. As for everything other than He, that dwells in imaginal existence. But when the real becomes manifest within this imaginal existence, He only becomes manifest in keeping with its reality, not in His essence, which is true being." Given what we've learned, we could thus say that the universe is God's dream, ultimately a dream about Himself. Just as we dream of a bunch of different characters and events, but the dreamer is only one, it's just us, so God dreams a dream about God's self playing a bunch of roles, all in loving celebration of divinity. This imagery becomes especially clear in his masterpiece called The Bezels of Wisdom, and especially in the chapter dedicated to the prophet Joseph, who of course is known as the greatest dream interpreter. And so naturally this chapter is about at least the first couple of pages, is dedicated to imagination and dreams in some way. Even the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, "All men are asleep, and when they die, they wake up." And Ibn Arabi writes in this chapter that our experience of our limited imagination and dreaming is only the microcosmic dream within the macrocosmic dream of God. He says, quote, "In truth, this whole earthly life was after this fashion, being a dream within a dream." Again, not a dream or illusion as something negative or unimportant. The world is very much real as far as we are concerned, but it is nothing but this creative dream of God, the manifestation of being within the awareness that is identical to that being. It is no surprise then that the goal of all existence is not only for God to experience God's self through another, but also to be praised. Now, because Ibn Arabi was a Muslim, this obviously involved the practices and beliefs of Islam to him. But on a broader scale, the goal of the human is to know herself. There is another saying of the Prophet Muhammad that Ibn Arabi uses all the time, where it is said that, quote, "He who knows himself knows his Lord." This is what we are to do. Because our reality is a microcosmic mirror of the macrocosm, the locus in which the attributes of being are manifested, the only way that we can know God is to know ourselves, to truly know ourselves and our true reality as nothing in itself, but in that nothingness also discover that that nothingness is the absolute fullness of being itself. There's a lot more we could say about Ibn Arabi, of course, and this has just been a very brief introduction, but I think that will suffice for our discussion today. And thus I hope I have shown that Ibn Arabi, at least to me, can be a serious contender in the contemporary world of philosophy in general, but especially also, possibly, in the discussions around idealism. And what I will do for the last few minutes of this episode is something that I basically never do. So I'm breaking my own habits and rules here, and that is to do a philosophical comparison. Now, the reason I don't do that is that it's quite irresponsible and dangerous a lot of the time to do these kinds of comparisons, because they will often neglect, by trying to compare and find these kind of parallels in different traditions and so on, you're often rejecting or neglecting the importance of the specific socio-political and religious context in which a particular idea or a text or philosophy emerges and lives in. It only exists in its particular context. And so you're simplifying when you're trying to make these comparisons, and that often leads to more misunderstanding rather than clarifying of what these unique individuals and mystics or philosophers are actually trying to say within their own particular context. Without trying to do that, trying to actually honor the uniqueness and individuality of all these thinkers, I wanted to try to compare this Akbarian thought of Ibn Arabi with two other prominent idealists. One of them is a person I mentioned at the beginning, the brilliant Indian sage and philosopher Abhinavagupta, who is a representative of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, also known as Kashmir Shaivism, one of the most brilliant philosophers in Indian history. And also, the third person I'm using for this comparison is the contemporary philosopher or idealist writer Bernardo Kastrup, who has presented something that he calls analytic idealism that has become quite there's gotten a lot of attention and become quite popular over the last few years. So first of all, what is the nature of reality itself? What does it consist of fundamentally? Well, arguably here, all three could be considered to adhere to some kind of ontological monism or non-dualism, even if it is, of course, a lot more complicated than that. In Abhinavagupta's Tantric Shaivism, ultimate reality is identified with Shiva, who is pure consciousness, awareness, and being itself. This is a different name for the ultimate reality, of course, Shiva versus Allah or al-Haqq, but seemingly they conceive of them in very similar ways. That one consciousness, which is Shiva, is all things without exception. They are all simply expressions of the vibrating self-awareness of Shiva, thus inherently one and unified. Abhinavagupta says, quote, "Therefore everything is one. All this is a single reality consisting of consciousness alone, free and blissful, unbroken by time, uncircumscribed by place, unclouded by attributes or adjuncts, unconfined by forms or appearances, unexpressible by words, and not unfolded by the ordinary means of knowledge. For it is the cause, through its own will alone, by which time, space, forms, and so on, each attain their own natures. This reality is free and independent, a mass of bliss, and that alone am I. Everything is reflected within it, within me. Now, secondly, in Kastrup's analytic idealism, only consciousness exists fundamentally. Consciousness is not born out of matter, but the other way around. The physical world is an appearance within the one consciousness, or mind at large, as he calls it. He says, spatially unbound consciousness is posited to be nature's sole ontological primitive. We, as well as all other living organisms, are dissociated alters of this unbound consciousness. The universe we see around us is the extrinsic appearance of phenomenality surrounding but dissociated from our alter. The inanimate universe we see around us is the extrinsic appearance of mentation in the segment of universal mind that is not comprised in any alter, which I shall call mind at large. So the inanimate universe is indeed outside of our individual psyches, that is, outside of our respective alters, but still inside universal mind. Now, to Ibn Arabi, God as wujūd, or being, is that which per definition is. There is no reality outside of God, as God is al-Haqq, the real itself. That wujūd is one, hence reality is pervaded by an essential oneness. As we also saw, wujūd or being could also be considered cognate with and somewhat synonymous with consciousness or awareness, as it is self-knowing. And we also saw that the world is God's dream within God's knowledge and imagination. Quote, there is in being only God, and only God recognizes God. And from this truth speaks the one who says, I am God, such as Abu Yazid, and exalted am I, like others among the men of God who came before. But importantly, what I think characterizes these systems, quote-unquote, especially the Shaiva and Akbari one, is that they are all comprehensive in their inclusion of the reality of multiplicity within this oneness. Unlike many other forms of monism or non-dualism, such as Advaita Vedanta, at least their caricature of Advaita Vedanta, where multiplicity is emphasized more as maya or illusion, here things are a bit more complex. Abhinavagupta school is often referred to as a non-dualism, and this can certainly be argued to be true in one sense, but it also isn't a non-dualism in the same way as Advaita Vedanta. The non-dual nature of Shiva is such that its oneness includes multiplicity in itself as expressions of itself. The world isn't an illusion or unreal, it is real as Shiva in all its diversity and multiplicity, while its fundamental reality remains one. So it's a non-dualism that transcends non-dualism in how non-dual it is, by not even excluding multiplicity from it. Kastrup is a little harder to fit in neatly here, but he similarly doesn't deny the world of multiplicity, but sees it as an extrinsic appearance of mental processes. What we experience is real, but it doesn't exist outside of mind at large. He says, quote, analytic idealism embraces realism, i.e. that there is an external world out there independent of our individual minds, independent of our observation, volition, fantasies, preferences, rituals, etc. Naturalism, i.e. the phenomena of the external world unfolds spontaneously according to nature's own inherent dispositions, and not according to external intervention by a divinity outside nature. Rationalism, human reason can recognize and model the irregularities of nature's behavior. And reductionism, complex phenomena can be explained in terms of simpler ones. However, analytic idealism then infers that the external world is of the same ontic kind or essence as our individual minds. And Kastrup is of course very different from the others in the sense that he doesn't use theistic or theological language. He doesn't talk about God, at least not very much, right? Rather, he uses much more secular, quote-unquote, terms like mind, as we saw. Ibn Arabi, I would argue, is similar, although it is phrased and conceived in a different way. While reality and being is one, that being manifests itself and reflects its attributes as the various forms of the cosmos without itself in its essence becoming changed or becoming those things as such. The world is a real appearance of the infinite attributes of being, it's itself disclosure. It is through multiplicity in the varied forms of the world that God shows God's self to us and through us to himself. Multiplicity and the world is thus honored, real, and important while being incorporated into a wider context of the oneness of being. It's real as manifestation, but unreal in terms of being self-subsistent or self-existent. Another place where I feel like there are some really interesting similarities is in how they conceive of the origin of multiplicity and the way that they describe it, right? How does the one become many? Or how does the one become many without itself ceasing to be one at the same time? And both Ibn Arabi and Abhinav Gupta very similarly trace the origin of the emergence of the world of multiplicity to the self-knowledge or self-awareness of the one divine reality, which Abhinav Gupta calls Shiva and all these other names, and Ibn Arabi calls God, Allah, or al-Haqq, the real, and so on. To Abhinav Gupta, Shiva is both the still absolute light of consciousness, but that consciousness also has a self-reflexive aspect, which is known as vimarsha. That dynamic self-knowledge is what is known as Shakti, the divine feminine. And it is this self-knowing of pure consciousness that is the vibration, the spanda, from which the universe appears within this one awareness itself. Thus, Shiva's reality becomes known and manifest as the multiplicity of the world, including ourselves, as Shakti, the activity of the self-reflexive nature of consciousness itself. Kastrup, who is usually the most different from the others in expression, would also hold that while mind at large is all that fundamentally is, the different things and subjective experience of individuality and distinction come about through dissociation. We are, as he said, dissociated alters of universal consciousness or mind at large that through this dissociation experience ourselves as individual and distinct, but are really only the one consciousness. He sometimes compares this to an ocean, which is one and unified, but in which there appear whirlpools of individual consciousness that we experience. It is something happening in the wider ocean of the one mind. It is a localized individual event, consciousness in this case, but it's never separate from the wider ocean of consciousness or mind at large. Ibn Arabi says that God knows himself eternally, and that knowledge of his infinite attributes and names, who love to become manifested, creates an impulse to give reality to the infinite variety of things in manifest existence. In order for God to be experienced in fullness and in all the ways that God can be experienced, that must include an experience of God as other. Thus, God's names and attributes manifest as multiplicity, which simultaneously veil and display his reality at the same time. Both Ibn Arabi and Abhinav Gupta even use a very similar mirror metaphor to explain this, saying that the world is a reflection of the nature of the divine in the mirror of his own awareness. Abhinav Gupta also says that our fundamental problem is a dissociation, right? That we, as Shiva becomes this multiplicity and we exist as individual creatures, we dissociate from what we truly are, which is the one consciousness of Shiva, and we start identifying with this limited mind and body. Thus we dissociate and misunderstand that our true reality is Shiva only. And the language of spanda or vibration within awareness is quite similar to the whirlpool analogy. And Ibn Arabi, as we saw, uses the language of veiling. In order for God to experience God's self through another, he has to veil himself through the forms of multiplicity and apparent independence of creatures. But really they are all dependent on his being, and their self-existence is in this sense illusory. He veils himself with himself. Now, importantly, both Ibn Arabi and Abhinav Gupta are distinct from Kastrup in the sense that the latter sees this dissociation as a kind of fracturing of consciousness, which would not be accurate for the others. Shiva freely limits himself through his will and freedom, and God in Ibn Arabi is never fractured or veiled from seeing something himself. This veiling, quote unquote, is only on the level of the world of multiplicity and the individual creatures. Now, related to this, one place where we can't really say that they all agree with each other, this is where they're different to some degree, is in what they think is the correct response to this predicament of reality. Not necessarily that it is a predicament, but really like what is the goal or purpose of our lives in face of this reality. Kastrup, as far as I know, doesn't really talk much about any kind of goal of life in his analytic idealism, but uses much more philosophical and kind of objective. He just talks about it objectively, not so much soteriologically and so on. He does talk about the fact that he believes that death, whether it is a physical death or the kind of ego death, often talked about, that can be brought on by certain substances, is really a seizing of activities of the brain, which is the source of this dissociation from mind at large, where we start identifying with these alters, so that death is really a seizing of that dissociation and a re-emergence back into the mind at large. So we stop identifying as these limited creatures because the individual dies, but we sort of merge back into mind at large and the one consciousness. Right? So even though that's not kind of a goal, it's still kind of, it's you know, you'll see. There are some similarities there. As for the other two, they are much more integrated into religious and spiritual traditions, right? So they use a lot more religious language and also are much more explicitly interested in our human response to the situation of life. And they say a lot more about what they think is the meaning and purpose of our life as human beings in this life, in this universe. The philosophical system that Abhinavagupta and his Tantrikas are associated with, so it's a whole thing. There are practices, there's the tantric text and so on, but the philosophical system is often referred to as pratyabhijna, which means recognition. And so this school is often known as the school of recognition. And what this school, this philosophy argues is that, as we have seen, all things are really this one consciousness of Shiva. Everything is Shiva, without distinction. It's all pervaded by this oneness. But we have misunderstood, and we have identified with these illusory, limited minds and bodies and identities here in life. Even though they are manifestations of being, still we misunderstand ourselves to be independent of that and to not be that. And so the goal of our lives is to recognize, right? This is in the name itself, to recognize our true reality, to remember, you could say, and recognize that we are really that one consciousness, that one reality, that one divine light that's known by many names, including Shiva. That's pratyabhijna, as Abhinavagupta talks about it, and that's kind of the goal of life, really, is to recognize and remember what we really are, that we were that one blissful awareness all along. In Ibn Arabi's Sufism, we find something very similar. In fact, the term Sufism is somewhat problematic here, since he didn't necessarily see himself as a Sufi. He talks about Sufis as something other than himself, as another kind of group. What he calls himself is a muhaqqiq, which means a realizer or a verifier, someone who does tahqiq. And tahqiq means, again, realization or verification. A realization of our true identity, of our true nature, and the true nature of reality and being itself. This is quite similar, I would say. And again, as we saw, many of these, particularly Islamic mystics, often go back to that quote that's attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, that he who knows himself knows his Lord. That this is the very core of the mystical path. To know God, we must know ourself and our true reality in relationship to God and in the oneness of being. This is not something that happens through reasoned thinking, but through what they call unveiling, or kashf in Arabic. It's unveiling, taking away of the veil of illusion and seeing things for what they truly are. These are just a few comparisons that we can make to show that while it might be up for debate whether or not Ibn Arabi should be called an idealist, I recognize that, that might depend on how widely we define that term and so on. But still, that I think he can and maybe should at least be considered part of the conversation. Of course, we can maybe extend and develop some of these comparisons a bit more in future episodes if we want to do that. We'll see. But for now, the purpose of this episode has been to showcase the philosophy of Ibn Arabi and the Akbari school, particularly from a more philosophical perspective, by making some educated interpretations on how some of his themes might be extended or fit into a contemporary intellectual debate, without divorcing him from his Islamic intellectual framework and the importance that has for his thought and all of the things we have talked about today, but still be able to look at him as someone who has something to offer to our modern intellectual debates today, maybe even debates about idealism. I hope this has been informative and not too complicated. After all, it's really hard to know what to include and exclude when it comes to someone who is so comprehensive and who has such a vast vision of reality. But nonetheless, thank you all so much for listening and for watching. I want to extend a special thank you as always to my patrons who support this channel monetarily, without whom none of this would be possible. I would highly appreciate if someone else wanted to become a patron, and I will leave links to that in the description. You can also leave a one-time donation through PayPal if that's more your thing. I want to remind you of my music. I also make music, and I just put out a new song not that long ago called Before It's Too Late, which has received wonderful reactions so far. So please, more of you, check it out and let me know what you think. I would really appreciate that. You can follow me on my socials, on Instagram, on TikTok. It's Philip Holm on all of them nowadays, so it's easy to find. You can also find me in my link tree in the description, where all of my links, even my new Substack. I just started a Substack, so there's that. You can check that out. Also check out my other channel called Philip Holm, which is dedicated to music. So me talking about music, just like I talk about religion and philosophy and so on here, and also posting my own music and music videos and so on. So go check that out. It's all in the link tree in the description. So go to that. Again, thank you so much for listening. Look forward to more stuff about Ibn Arabi and the Akbari school in the future. And I'll see you next time.